Alrighty, friends. So for our last bit of video, we are going to look at how communities change over time, right? So the one constant thing in our planet is constant change, right? Everything is always, in a sense, becoming more chaotic. If you've heard of something called the chaos theory or looked at things called entropy, there's like a continuous amount of chaos that is occurring throughout our planet. So what we're going to consider here, of course, the Everglades specifically, and then to really kind of just tie this in all together. So how do communities change over time? So the changes in the Everglades have been extreme, but natural systems also experience change just in general, right? Nature is not static. It's always changing. And it's always cycling, right? So we have seasonal change. You can have things like natural disasters, so floods, fires, avalanches, landslides, things like that. And that's a natural thing, right? Whereas, of course, then there's the humans coming in and changing things up a bit. But then there's this term of ecological succession. So that's the process of community change over time. So this would be the progressive replacement of a species due to changing environmental conditions that existing species then create, which makes it more habitable for other species to outcompete earlier inhabitants. So an example here would be that of a grassland, say, for example, which eventually, after being grassy for many, many years and doing its purpose of being awesome grass, the ground is then rich with nutrients from yearly decay of grasses, which, by the way, this is a good point, that when you have trees in the fall, in the wintertime, when the leaves fall down, you actually want them to stay kind of on the ground because they act as a sort of fertilizer and replacing the nutrients in your grasses. But it's not aesthetically pleasing, so we always have to rake our leaves. But then what happens once, if you have this grassland area, if a tree seed, say, is dropped from a bird passing by, then that soil would then have enough nutrients and moisture to help support the growth of a tree. And then when that tree grows, it will then maybe shade out the grasses. Right? So thank you, grass, so much for putting in your time, giving nutrients to the soil and moisture, preserving that moisture. And then all of a sudden a tree is like, my time has come. And it then grows, which then shades out the grasses. So this is a figure from your book that looks at forest ecological succession, which depends again on soil and light availability. This is really quite fascinating, actually, where like you go from just straight rock. So you're not considering soil. And this is maybe where you can also start to envision like how things started to form on land once the ozone layer was formed and life was able to sustain itself above water without being fried to death. So we start with rocks. And just straight up rocks, no soil, no nutrients, nothing like that. But then things called lichens can then attach to bare uncolonized rock surfaces where they can grow and die over years, which then allows soil to form and accumulate, which allows moss to then start to accumulate on those rocks as well. You've actually probably encountered lichens before if you've gone to a beach or gone tide pooling. They're kind of like these really interesting little, almost sort of like mossy looking things, but some of them also look like little, almost like ancient, like ancient cockroaches where it's just their skeleton on the thing, but they're actually living things. Really fascinating. I encourage you to look up some of the local lichens that we have here and see if you can find them next time you go to the beach or to tide pools. Anyways, next up, after you have soil that's built up over time, this allows larger plants to come in and move in, and smaller herbs and grasses and then smaller shrubs can start to make their time known. And then sun-tolerant trees, in this case such as pines and cedars, will then move in because there's enough soil to support large root systems. And then, of course, they grow and grow and grow over time. Trees are extraordinarily resilient, and they can live for a very, very long time, which produces, once they're kind of up and established, they can produce shade, which then changes conditions and favors various plant species. It's really fascinating also to consider different kinds of forests, right? We have tropical forests, we have boreal forests, we have our redwood forests and sequoia forests, right? So, and then those can support various other species as well. So it's really fascinating, I think, to really consider these different ideas. And then let's see here. Last little idea that I want to dive into is looking at two different types of succession. And your book goes into this pretty nicely as well. But first we have the primary succession. So this would be where there's an occurrence of a previously uninhabited environment. So a really nice example of that is from the previous slide, actually. So starting from just rocks, no soil, and there's no suitable and not a suitable environment for things to grow, like lichens, which can then allow mosses to grow, and trees, shrubs, etc., as we discussed in the previous slide. Then there's something called secondary succession, and that's where life is already present. And this takes place after a disturbance, and some disturbances you can consider would be like fires, logging practices, storms, etc. And then life just kind of takes back over. It's actually really fascinating. Some couple of examples that pop into my mind of this, of course, we're in a very fire-prone region. So you can go to areas where fires have ravaged through, like up in Napa, Sonoma, even parts of South Lake Tahoe or other various parts of Tahoe, even up further north, up in like Southern Oregon, where they had some pretty nasty fires as well. Go back a few years after that fire and you can see regrowth, and it's really quite fascinating. And fire is actually a really nice natural way of just kind of like taking everything out for a second and then putting it back into allowing more new growth to occur. Another thing would be like a volcanic eruption. So when Mount St. Helens blew her top off, that caused a lot of species death in that surrounding area. And more recently, as in the past like 5 or 10 years, has new growth finally been able to occur. So sometimes it can be relatively quick, like with fires, or other times it takes several decades. But another kind of silly example I have here is think of scenes from like apocalypse movies or shows where once you remove the humans as the disturbance, then nature can recapture that area with things like grasses, vines, and trees. The one that comes to mind is, to me anyways, Jurassic Park, like Jurassic Park 2 and 3, the originals, not the Jurassic World stuff that's unfortunately in existence now. But once they come to where those former like park buildings are, you can see they're completely retaken over by trees and vines and things like that. So that's maybe something that you can, when you're trying to think of the differences between primary and secondary. Primary is like life starting from square one, whereas secondary you're starting from square one, but in a different way where things were already established beforehand. So that then entails module 2.3 in your book, and looking at community ecology. And that basically wraps up our sort of first unit. So be sure to re-go over some of these ideas because you will be tested on them in the next coming week. So thank you again so much for watching. Hope you have a lovely day.